All right, hello everyone, we're live. So I thought that it would be worth responding to a video of a debate between William Lane Craig and Stephen Law. I think I'll skip over Stephen Law's parts, maybe, we'll see. So yeah. And this was a debate about whether or not God exists.
Thank you. Thank you and good evening. Let me begin by thanking Premier Christian Radio for inviting me to participate in this event this evening. And I also want to express my appreciation to Stephen Law as well for his participation. During the years that
Yeah, so I have no disagreement so far.
Jan and I lived in England during my doctoral studies at the University of Birmingham, we grew to have a warm affection for this country and for her people. And so it is a sincere joy and a privilege for me to be participating in an event like this. And I thank you for coming. Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there are good reasons to think that God exists. And secondly, there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now, I'll leave out the...
Yeah, I mean, so this is a slight, well, no, I mean, I think that this is a fine framing. The thing is, atheism is just the belief that God doesn't exist. So it would be sort of strange to say, like, I would like to defend, first, that there are good reasons to believe in mathematical realism. And second, there are no good reasons to believe in not mathematical realism. Yeah, I don't know, it's sort of weird phrasing, but...
to Dr. Law to present his arguments for atheism before I respond to them. In this opening speech, I want to sketch briefly 3 lines of evidence in favor of God's existence. As a professional philosopher, I think that God makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience, including...
I'm quite curious as to why Craig only chose to go with 3 of the arguments. Usually Craig goes with like way more than 3. Usually Craig will go with like, argument from personal experience, argument from the resurrection, argument from fine-tuning, the moral argument, and the argument from the Kalam. So I'm wondering why Craig only chose to go with 3, but well, we'll see.
Philosophical.
Maybe he was scared. He knew that Stephen Law would take down the Kalam in one fell swoop.
Scientific, moral, and historical considerations. Number 1, then, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Did it have a beginning, or does it just go back and back forever? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused.
Citation needed?
But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, which call into question that assumption. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. To give just one example, suppose you had an infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity, and I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins?
I mean, yeah, infinity is sort of weird and counterintuitive, but that doesn't mean that infinity doesn't exist. Mathematicians frequently use infinity for, like, infinite set theory. The same objections could be levied against infinity in the context of mathematics, saying, like, how many even numbers are there? How many odd numbers are there? Or they're the same number of even and odd numbers because they're both infinite. It's just that infinity doesn't jive with our intuitions very well, but yeah.
Would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? Well, 3. So infinity.
Yeah, so the point is you just can't very fruitfully subtract infinity from infinity.
Infinity minus infinity is 3. In each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with self-contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any answer.
I mean, you could run very parallel arguments for 0, 6 times 0 equals 0. Well, okay, what's 0 over 0? Mathematics gets weird. There are certain operations that you can't do with certain numbers. You can't really divide things by 0, and you can't add or subtract or multiply or divide by infinity very fruitfully.
From 0 to infinity. For this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But in the real world, such a convention has no sway. Obviously, you can give away whatever coins you want. Here's another example of the absurdity of
Well, but then you couldn't give away infinite coins. Like, if there is a contradiction, then you can't do it.
an infinite past. Take the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Suppose that for every orbit that Saturn completes around the sun, the planet Jupiter completes 2. If Saturn has completed 10 orbits, Jupiter has completed 20. If Saturn has completed 1 trillion, Jupiter has completed 2 trillion. The longer they orbit, the farther Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter.
Yeah, so there's an argument that Malpass and Morrison make in a 2020 paper, which is that all of the arguments levied against an infinite past can apply just as much to an infinite future. Craig thinks that there will be an infinite future. Why does he think that an infinite past is impossible? Will the total number, like, let's imagine that in heaven there are 2 counters. Counter 1 ticks twice a day. Counter 2 ticks once a day. Will the number of counters for they'll both be infinite, as x goes to infinity. So does that result in metaphysical absurdity? It applies the same way to the future. And there's just an intuitive, symmetry between the past and the future in this regard.
But now, turn the story around. Suppose Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the sun from eternity past. Now, which one will have completed the most orbits? Well, the correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical.
Well, what if they will be completing orbits from the future? It's also like, infinity stuff gets weird, and but I mean, if you have 2x minus x, as x goes to infinity, 2x minus x will go to infinity rather than to undefined, because it passes in a predictable fashion. So, it could be that the number of differences in the orbit is still infinity, but I don't know. Infinity gets weird, but the fact that things are weird and counterintuitive does not mean that we cannot reason about them at all, and does not mean that they're metaphysically impossible, given that Craig has at other points admitted that there are no logical contradictions surrounding infinity.
That seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the greater the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical simply by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past. But
yeah, so Craig repeats this, though I think it was Guth. This was pointed out in his debate with Carroll. Carroll had Guth on, I think it was Guth, maybe it was Bord or Vilenkin, but had him on video saying that he thinks that the past is probably infinite. It does not rule out an infinite past. It just rules out an infinite past under certain conditions relating to entropy or something. I don't remember the exact details. Cosmology is not my area of expertise. But Craig just repeats this lie over and over again. It's rather frustrating. Though maybe this was before the debate with Sean Carroll, so who knows?
But must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we can't yet provide a physical description of the first split second of the universe. But the Bord-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of any physical description of that moment. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state of the early universe, which some scientific popularizers have misleadingly and inaccurately referred to as nothing, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. Even if our universe is just a tiny part of a so-called multiverse composed of many universes, their theorem requires that the multiverse itself must have an absolute beginning. Of course,
well, no, I mean, I think that the multiverse could, if we think that time is an emergent phenomena of something else, then the multiverse could have this, other thing that's not time. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is that if we think modal realism is true, which I don't, but it's certainly possible, and that everything that's metaphysically possible actually exists. Well, if we think that modal realism is possible, then that would mean that modal realism results that if modal realism is true, it doesn't result in time. It's just that all possible worlds exist and are temporally distinct.
Highly speculative scenarios, such as loop quantum gravity models, string models, even closed time-like curves have been proposed to try to avoid this absolute beginning. Now, these models are all fraught with problems, but the bottom line is that none of these theories, even if true, succeed in restoring an eternal past. At most, they just push the beginning back a step. But then the inevitable question arises.
Yeah, so Craig says that the universe began to exist. However, Craig has admitted that this premise does not go through if we accept the B theory of time, which is a consensus view among both scientists and philosophers of time. The B theory of time says that time is essentially like a dimension, sort of like space. So the world is like this sort of four-dimensional block that exists throughout space-time. And if that's true, then things don't begin. There are not moments in time when things are, and then at other moments they stop being, and then that moment is true. Just all of the temporal moments all exist simultaneously. Well, time doesn't simultaneously is a weird way of describing it, and so then the universe didn't come into existence. And Craig agrees that if the B theory of time is true, his argument does not go through. However, the B theory of time is the consensus view among both philosophers of time and among both philosophers of time and physicists. Yeah, also as Minge points out, it's in the fixed beginning contingent on the physical laws we observe. It could have done something before that apparent start wasn't in accordance with the law. Yeah, no, this is exactly right. Craig tries to rule it out like a priori with philosophical arguments, but if there's a reason why, when trying to figure out the origins of the universe, we generally defer to the physicists rather than to the philosophers, which is that the philosophers don't really know what they're talking about as much as the physicists do. Obviously, if there was a sufficiently compelling philosophical argument that absolutely ruled it out, like, if physicists saw the need to invoke square circles to explain something, we would have good reason to reject that. In general, I would defer to physicists on matters of physics rather than philosophers. This is not to say that philosophy is useless. It's just to say that philosophers are not physicists.
Why did the universe come into being? What brought the universe into existence? Some intrepid atheists have asserted that the universe just popped into being without a cause. But surely that's metaphysically impossible.
When he says popped into being without a cause, like he portrays it as like, there was nothing and then a universe happened. Well, so from nothing is a weird way of phrasing it. A better way of phrasing it would be not from anything. And Craig agrees that God didn't come from anything. Now, Craig just says that it's only that things that begin to exist have to have a cause. But we all agree that there was something uncaused. It would be weird to describe God as having popped into being. And it's similarly weird to describe the universe as having popped into being. It's just there wasn't anything. Like there just was not anything preceding the universe. It's not that like that there was nothing that was floating around for a long time, and then eventually a universe popped into being. There just was not anything. Nothing is not. It's not a thing. It's an absence of things. And so the notion that the universe doesn't have a cause, I don't understand why that's absurd. They did. Special relativity, I think, assumes that. But so, it's not clear why, like, so, Craig, I don't think he does it in this debate, but Craig will generally appeal to this in two ways. The first way is he'll say, or three ways. He'll say, it seems metaphysically absurd that things pop from nothing. But I don't understand why we would trust our intuitions about nothing, especially our intuitions based on the misleading way that Craig frames it. Second, Craig will say, inductively, everything that we see that begins to exist has a cause. But that's not good evidence at all, given that the first thing will obviously have characteristics that the things that we see don't have, right? The first thing will, everything that we, so, you could run a similar inductive argument, which is what Scott Cliff did in his debate with Craig. You could run the argument that everything that has a cause has a spatiotemporal cause. God does not have a spatiotemporal, the universe cannot have a spatiotemporal cause. Therefore, the universe could not have had a cause. Just these inductive generalizations of things within space and time cannot apply to space and time itself. That would be the fallacy of composition. And so then third, Craig will say that like if we saw something, we would assume that it had an explanation. But we would assume that it had a non-God explanation, presumably. If you were walking at a park and you saw something, you wouldn't assume that it was caused directly by God. You would assume it had a spatio-temporal cause. And so just none of these arguments are at all successful. And there are an infinite number of similar generalizations that you could do the same argument. So you can say everything that has a cause has a spatio-temporal cause. The universe doesn't have a spatio-temporal cause, therefore it doesn't have a cause. The support for this, one, it's a metaphysical first principle. Second, if we saw something, we would assume that it has spatio-temporal cause. And third, inductively, everything that has a cause has a non-omnipotent cause. The universe, and so the universe couldn't have had an omnipotent cause. If the universe couldn't have had an omnipotent cause, God does not exist. It's a metaphysical first principle that can't be caused by omnipotent things. They're just infinite ways of running this, and none of them are successful at all. And the notion of causality, there are sort of weird questions relating to causality. The most popular view is some form of the counterfactual model. The counterfactual model says A causes B if not A would result in not B, but if you have A, B will happen. If you don't have A, B won't happen. But the counterfactual view just does not make much sense in the context of a necessary being, which Craig claims God is. Now, I mean, there are ways around it, but it just feels like Craig sort of uses these ambiguous things like time and cause to have intuitively sounding principles while just glossing over very controversial views, like debates in the philosophy of time and in the philosophy of causation.
Such a conclusion is, in the words of philosopher of science Baron of Königseider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So why?
Well, Craig agrees that lots of things come out of nothing. He just thinks that things don't begin to exist out of nothing. He thinks that, mathematics comes from nothing, morality comes from nothing. Comes from nothing is a weird way of phrasing it, but that they don't they're not caused by something. There's nothing that causes mathematics, moral truths, modal truths, logical truths, or God, right? So we all agree that there are some uncaused things. Craig is appealing to the absurdity of things coming from nothing, but he has to, his real pitch should be, yes, I agree that things can have no cause, but things can't begin to exist with no cause. But that's just a way less intuitively plausible principle, and that doesn't seem to have the same intuitive metaphysical backing that the principle that Craig is trying to appeal to does.
Why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. Premise 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3,
I'm not sure what Craig would mean by transcendent cause. So yeah, that seems ambiguous. But so I would say that I'd say that my credence in P1 is about a little bit above 50%, so 65% chance that P1 is true. Or no, sorry, not 55. No, lower, because B theory of time stuff. Say that my credence in P1 is 35%. My credence in P2 is depending on what exactly is meant, also maybe 30%. So overall, my credence and the conclusion from these is that 30% times 35%, which I have to do the math, but yeah.
Therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. Now,
follows logically and inescapably.
From the very nature of the case, This cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial.
Wait, okay. Uncaused. So that's not strictly true, right? It could be that the thing that causes the universe is caused by something else. But the like first cause, sure, it has to be uncaused. So it has to be changeless. That's not clear. It being atemporal prior to the first moment of time doesn't mean that it can't change after the first moment of time. And it's not even like, it seems like change has to take place temporally. And so I don't, like, it's not clear what it would mean. Like, yeah, it's not clear what it would mean to say that it's changeless, and it's not clear why it would have to be changeless. Timeless, so yes, it would have to be timeless because it would have to exist outside of time. Spaceless, no. It could be that there are some spacey particles that make things that from which time emerges, that have space and that combine in ways to form things. I don't know, but neither does Craig. And so it's not clear how we could rule out the first thing being composed of space. So yeah, I don't think that the spaceless criteria works. And all Craig has it's ruled out with the universe beginning to exist is that the particles that exist within space and time have to have begun to exist. But that doesn't mean that there can't be particles from which time emerged in some way that existed, sans time. Immaterial, well, yeah, that's spaceless, right? That would be the same thing.
Material being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore...
Wait, that's not... So it created space-time, where space-time is defined as the parity between space and time. That doesn't mean that it had to transcend timeless space. It just seems like so fruitless to sort of try to form high confidence metaphysical conclusions about what was around prior to time. It just seems like such a bad idea. Like it's so hard to imagine what things are like sans time.
Or be immaterial, not physical. Now, there are only two possible candidates that could fit such a description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or an unembodied mind or consciousness.
Why? I mean, we have no experience with unembodied minds. So if the claim is that, like, there are only two things that we know of. Well, no, there's only one thing that we know of, which are abstract objects. But they obviously couldn't have done it, so that would have to be something else. Maybe it could be an abstract mind, but that doesn't, but an abstract, like, it's hard to think about an abstract mind having thoughts and bringing about things atemporally. Like, it seems like by its nature, an abstract, like, what does it mean to, make a decision, but not within time? That just seems like it's not even clear, what it would mean to make a decision if time does not exist. And so, and also, even if we granted that it's a disembodied mind, there's no reason why it would have to be like a good disembodied mind. Now, Craig will admit this later, but this obviously doesn't get him to the God of the Bible or even some good God. It could be an evil God. It could be just an apathetic God. And there are so many other candidates. Maybe it could be this sort of disembodied force, sort of like the laws of physics, where there are disputes about whether or not the laws of physics are between the Humeans and the neo-Humeans, but it could be that just this sort of disembodied law of physics that says that, like, that generates particles or something. The laws of physics seem to be, if they're not just intrinsic properties of objects, but if they're really laws that govern the objects, it seems like they would be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, transcendent. And so that seems like another way. It's not clear what would have to be a mind. Like, it seems like it could be like sort of like a computer program of some sort. It could be just that, like, it could be we could be living in a simulation, like the simulation hypothesis. It could be just some sort of basic metaphysical law. It could be some physical thing that has certain properties from which time emerges. Just none of this is on at all firm ground, and Craig just asserts that this is a true dichotomy without any justification.
But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind. And thus we are brought not merely to an uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
But I mean, Craig thinks that God is necessary, but nothing that we can conceive of that's necessary seems to be able to be causally to cause things. Mathematics, modal truths, moral truths, logical truths, etc. None of those cause anything. So you can make a similar inductive generalization that necessary things can't cause. This actually jives better with like models of causality, like the counterfactual model.
Number 2, objective moral values and duties in the world. Our first argument gives us a transcendent personal creator of the universe, but it doesn't tell us anything about his moral character. How can we know that he is good? My second argument addresses that question. Premise 1 states, if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. By objective moral values, I mean values which are valid and binding, whether people believe in them or not. Many theists and atheists agree that if God does not exist, then moral values and duties are not objective in this sense. For example,
and many of them don't, right? Most philosophers are moral realists and are also atheists.
Michael Roos, an agnostic philosopher of science, states, morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory, end quote. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just a byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning, just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have developed similar behavior for the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has emerged among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality, which
Yeah, right. So obviously moral realists who are not theists are not going to grant this. Someone like me is going to think that morality is a rationally justifiable set of claims that much like evolution gave us the ability to figure out mathematical facts, it also gave us the ability to figure out moral facts. And this seems to be supported by our ability to do robust reasoning about ethics, coming to correct conclusions about things like the repugnant conclusion. And the badness of pain evolved because it served a biological thing. Pain is a possible thing. It's like metaphysically possible. And then the reason why pain exists is because it was advantageously useful. Making an action painful makes entities less likely to take that action.
Functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about this morality that makes it objectively binding and true. Certain actions, such as rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape is wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. Given atheism, the rape...
Right, but obviously, just because something goes on in the animal kingdom does not mean that atheists have to think that it's good.
Who chooses to flout the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, sort of moral equivalent of Lady Gaga, out of step with the herd. But that leads to our second premise. Objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. As philosopher Louise Anthony so nicely puts it, any argument for moral skepticism is going to depend upon premises which are less obvious than the reality of objective moral values themselves. I was gratified to see that in his published work, Dr. Law affirms the existence of objective moral values, such as tolerance and open-mindedness. He rejects relativism as, and I quote, politically correct twaddle of a rather noxious sort. Rightly so. Actions like rape, cruelty, racial hatred, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're truly evil. Michael Roos himself admits, the man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Some things, at least, are truly evil. But if that is the case, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. Some people think that evil in the world provides overwhelming evidence against the existence of God. I think the exact opposite is true. Real evil in the world actually serves to prove the existence of God. Since without God...
now might be a good time to respond to Craig's moral argument. So a couple of objections I have. First is one that I've raised before, which is Euclid's dilemma. The question is it good because God said so? Or does God say so because it's good? If it's good because God says so, then God could decree that you should torture infants for fun. and it would be objectively moral to do it. And in that case, morality is not binding. Yet if it's good independently of what God says, then that means that God is not the purveyor of morality, but rather just receives morality. It's sort of like logic. God can't do logically impossible things because even God is bound by logic. Now, someone like Craig says, well, it's not either of those. It's that it's good because it corresponds to God's character. But then the question is, okay, is it good because it corresponds to God's character, or does it correspond to God's character because it's good? If the former is true, then God could make anything good. Well, if the latter is true, then if it's good if it's good because it corresponds to God's character, then God's character could be pro-torturing infants for fun, and then that would be good. If it's independent of God's character, and it's not grounded in God's character. Second, so the question arises, is things that possess objective goodness on atheism, are they like metaphysically impossible? If so, it seems like that would merit further argument. Why are they metaphysically impossible? If they're not, and if they're metaphysically impossible, God can't do them because God can't do metaphysically impossible things. But if they're metaphysically possible, then they could exist on atheism. Third, if morality is grounded in God, then it becomes unclear what you mean by God's moral character being good. If that just means God's moral character corresponds to God's moral character, then that's not an informative claim at all. That's just saying that God's character is what his character is. And so at that point, moral claims just become wholly uninformative and are saying nothing. However, if you're making a substantive claim, then you mean that there's this external goodness thing that God's moral character corresponds to. And then in that case, then morality can't be grounded in God. And lots of Christians like Randall Rouser have agreed with this. I'm forgetting the order of things. Fourth, I think. There are lots of ways that atheists have provided accounts of morality. People like Michael Huemer, Derek Parfit, Peter Singer, Sinababu, Korsgaard's not a moral realist, but lots and lots of people have provided accounts of objective morality. And so to just say that there's no way of having objective morality on atheism is just incredibly misleading, given that there are hundreds of ways of doing it. And for Craig to say that they all fail without looking at how they do it, it's just sort of by just saying like, well, how do they do it? Well, people have written hundreds of pages on how to do it, and Craig just sort of ignores those because it takes longer to explain how one grounds objective moral values and duties, as he's so fond of saying, than it does to explain why. Than it does for him to say that atheism can't grant objective moral values and duties. Fifth, so the atheist can just ground morality in what God's character would be if he existed. So that the atheist can just say that morality is about what a perfect being would care about. And then that doesn't require God actually existing. It just requires that, saying that if God existed, here's what his character would be like. And so that's where morality is grounded. And that's sort of the ideal observer view of morality, which says that morality is grounded in what a ideal observer who's perfectly rational and perfectly impartial would do and would care about. Finally, at best all this proves is that moral anti-realism is true. But moral anti-realism is not like an unheard of view. There are lots of people who defend moral anti-realism. And so we can just grant that if moral anti-realism is true. I don't think moral anti-realism is true, but this is not the knockdown argument against atheism that Craig hopes that it is. If Craig thinks that there are ways of figuring things out about morality, then those ways, would be similarly open to the atheists. And so, if there are good ways of knowing that morality exists, as sort of this transcendent moral code, then whatever grounding Craig provides for those are similarly open to the atheist. And there's one seventh point, but I'm now forgetting what it was.
To ground objective moral values, good and evil as such would not exist. Number 3, the historical facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth. Our case so far gives us a generic monotheism affirmed by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. But do we know anything more about who this God is? Well, to answer that question, we have to look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was by all accounts a remarkable individual. Although Dr. Law has recently defended the claim that Jesus of Nazareth never even existed, historians have reached something of a consensus that Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. Now, most people would think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually 3 facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1, on the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups saw.
Yeah, so okay, a couple of points. So one, our reports of this are not especially reliable, right? All we have is copies of translations of anonymous hearsay accounts that we don't know if they're first person, second person, or third person, from biased sources where we don't have a good account, that were written down decades later after they've been in oral circulation for a while. There are similar cases with people like Saint Genevieve who had stories around them that had somewhat similar levels of backing. Same thing with the Mormons. Having lots of people writing down about miracles, decades later after things have been in oral circulation is not especially surprising. And so even if we don't have great reason to think that there was in fact an empty tomb. We have we have the Gospels writing about it, but it's not clear why we would put that much stock in the Gospels, which were written down decades later. There was so much reliability, especially because we know that such sort of claims of resurrections are relatively historically common. When this wasn't mentioned for several hundred years by any non-Christian historian, and it was only mentioned by his disciples. And when this was a time that was where magic was widely believed, so people would bang on pots and pans during an eclipse because they thought that it warded off demons. And so there was this just intolerable din during eclipses when people would bang on pots and pans really loudly in order to try to ward off the eclipse. This was not a time when skepticism was practiced. So we should not trust the accounts very much of this. But there are lots of ways of explaining the empty tomb. So one of the ways, and this is what Fodor argues, is that the body was moved by Joseph. Joseph, it was an expensive tomb. That it was reported in the Gospels that the burial was rushed. I think Jewish law says that they have to be buried in a different location. Roman authorities wanted it to be buried in a different location to avoid a fuss. So overall, we don't have any good reason to think that the body was not moved, and it just seems reasonably likely. They also could have gone to the wrong tomb. It's possible that the tomb was stolen. It's also, there's so many ways of the tomb being empty that don't require any supernatural explanation. Maybe Jesus's disciples were trying to trick people by saying that he rose from the dead. They're just oodles and oodles of ways for this to be the case. And especially when these were written down decades later, we don't have reason to trust them. Craig additionally mentioned how Jesus was, perfect. Well, yeah, I read the Gospel of Matthew yesterday. It's really not the sense that you get. Jesus condemned a divorce. He condemned hand washing as being pompous and pretentious. And his Gospels did not wash their hands, and Jesus defended this. He was brought to a high mountain by Satan that was high enough to see all the mountains of the world, which is impossible given that the earth is not flat. He got mad at a tree and then cursed it and made it never grow figs again because it didn't have fruit. It's just the stories are just wildly fantastical and bizarre, and they don't have the mark of divinity. Michael Humer gives the analogy of if you got a Nigerian prince a scammer email that claims that it came from a Nigerian prince, but it was full of spelling errors and was claiming that they needed your help. You should ignore it because, and the Gospels are similar, that you just don't have good reason to think that they're telling the truth.
Appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite having every predisposition to the contrary. And
so the last one, okay, so Fodor gives the RHBS model, which I don't know if it's the best model, but it's at least a fine model where he says there was reburial, so the body was reburied, which would be required by Jewish law. And Joseph would want to rebury him because he wouldn't want it to be in the expensive tomb. Jewish and Roman authorities wanted to avoid a fuss, etc. So there are lots of decent reasons to think reburial would be the case. Second, there would be hallucinations. This is not surprising. Hallucinations are relatively common, especially in religious settings, and especially bereavement hallucinations. I forget the exact figures, but these are quite common. And there are many cases of mass hallucinations, so like genital shrinking epidemics in Africa, the Westall UFO encounter of 1966, if I remember the date and the name correctly. And so none of these are in common. Third was marginalization. Was sort of marginalization of doubt. So people who did not believe it were marginalized and were it was a big communal thing to believe in it and for people to express their faith. And we know that hearing stories from other people affects people's memory of particular events. And so that would make it less reliable. And I'm forgetting all the acronyms, but the stories were spread throughout the community, and bereavement hallucinations are particularly common. And so this explains all the data. And this explains why the disciples reported belief in Jesus. Reported that he resurrected.
3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite having every predisposition to the contrary. N.T. Wright, an eminent New Testament scholar, concludes, that is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, natural...
Yeah, this is just false. Like, there are lots of qualified historians who do not believe Jesus was resurrected.
Explanation of these 3 facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that the best explanation of the evidence is that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. In summary then, I presented tonight a cumulative case.
Oh, yeah, so here, let me actually, I'll bring up my screen, okay? So I was taking some, okay, so I'm not by a New Testament scholar by any stretch of the imagination. But I was taking some notes on things that were written by people like Fodor. So as Bart Ehrman argues, the evidence may have been altered. So the stories, they'd been in oral circulation for years before any of the authors wrote them down. The stories changed. The Gospel of Matthew has the famous Sermon on the Mount, which is not in the other Gospels. Matthew was writing his account 50 years or so after the sermon was allegedly given. The books could have been written in reference to each other, which could explain the similarities. The Gospels are all in contradiction. Here are a bunch of contradictions. Matthew and Luke give contradictory genealogies for Joseph. Mark and John, only Matthew and Luke mention the virgin birth, which Mark and John don't. Matthew says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod, while Luke says Jesus was born while Quirinius was governor of Syria, which is contradictory because they were 10 years apart. Matthew says Herod had all male children 2 years and under put to death, yet historians are convinced this never occurred. The Gospels are absurd. They claim that the devil took Jesus to a high mountain and showed him the kingdoms of the world, which is not how high mountains work. Jesus condemns hand washing. He curses a fig tree. He claims that anyone who asks for anything in his name will automatically get it. And Richard Carrier presents a variety of considerations that countenance these. So, there are parallel false historical claims like the life of Saint Genevieve. Had people attest her divinity. B, the Gospels were written by religious people who were biased and intended to combat agnosticism. C, the Gospels are hagiographies. They're sacred accounts of historical figures which are notoriously unreliable. D, there was no non-Christian who mentioned the resurrection for decades. E, we have not even a single established historian mentioning the event until the 3rd and 4th centuries, and then only by Christian historians. The people who do mention it aren't historians, but are religious zealots. F, this was an age where magic was commonly believed. People banged on pots during eclipses. G, accounts of people dying for beliefs were written later and said Christians were executed. They never said that recanting would have saved them. They also were executed for other reasons. H, the original Christians didn't believe in a physical resurrection, but rather believed in Jesus appearing in visions and dreams. I, visions of God were common in that time. J, Paul didn't report bodily resurrection. K, the ending of Mark was ended later. Original ending was ambiguous, and the resurrection was added to the end of it later. L, the empty tomb for Mark was metaphorical, and empty tomb stories were common in fables. M, Matthew's later account was when the story had grown and was not likely, given that it told of a vast dramatic earthquake. N, Luke later changed the story and made it more concrete. O, John comes later when the story had grown more. And P, Plutarch wrote in the 2nd century that resurrection tales were very common. Fodor gives his reburial, individual hallucination account, biases and memory distortions, and socialization and marginalization of doubt. So reburial explains the empty tomb, and this is likely given that 1, Jewish laws require bodies to be taken down before evening. 2, the Gospels say that the burial was rushed. 3, criminals were buried in a different location from ordinary Jews. And 4, Jewish and Roman authorities wanted to keep public order and wanted the burial to be private. B, individual hallucinations. Several women followers saw hallucinations, according to Fodor. This is not surprising, given 1, 37% of people experience auditory hallucination. 2, they're especially common in religious settings. 3, bereavement hallucinations are common. About 1/3 of people heard and talked to the deceased. C, biases and memory distortions. We can get 76% of people to report seeing non-existing footage. There are lots of examples of historical mass hallucinations. Studies have found that people incorporate testimony of others, even false testimony, into their memory of events. And then D is socialization and marginalization of doubt. So as they talked with others, it sort of fleshed out and formed a more concrete, coherent narrative. And so this is a better theory, given that 1, it doesn't require invoking God, whose existence is a priori implausible. 2, it explains why Jesus appeared to certain disciples rather than to others. 3, it explains the empty tomb. Why would God resurrect Jesus bodily rather than giving him a new body or making him divine? Jesus could have appeared even if he wasn't resurrected, as some Gnostics believe. He might have been resurrected without appearing to anyone, as per the old copies of Mark. He might have appeared to anyone else, like the Mesoamericans, as the Mormons believe. In order to have the explanatory scope to account for all the facts, the resurrection hypothesis requires the key assumptions. 4, the theory is better because it doesn't rely on the assumption that God had a desire or a reason to raise Jesus from the dead. It's a priori unlikely. 5, it avoids the assumption that God sent down his son to be sacrificed. 6, it avoids Trinitarian confusion. We wouldn't expect God, a priori God to be 1 and 3 and all this mystery. And 7, it explains data if there being significant historical dispute about whether the evidence is decisive. If this were Jesus' single proof of resurrection evidence, it would be sufficiently decisive and convince qualified historians across the board, but it does not. So that's that's sort of the like simple version of my read of the historical evidence. And I didn't think that the historical evidence provides no evidence for the resurrection, but I don't think that it's anywhere near decisive. And lots of people like Alvin Plantinga agree with me. Especially when you just read the Gospels, they're like insane. They condemn hand washing. Same with the Old Testament. That seems to undercut it a little bit. And so yeah, I think that I don't think that it's anywhere near decisive. And even if it's a little bit of evidence, it's just nowhere near enough evidence to convince an otherwise uncertain person to accept the account. And I actually think that the RHBS model is able to explain things perfectly adequately. So yeah, let's hear.
Based on the origin of the universe, the existence of objective moral values and duties, and the resurrection of Jesus, for thinking that the God of Israel, the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth, exists. If Stephen wants us to believe otherwise, that atheism is true, he must first tear down all 3 of the arguments that I presented.
Craig always says this, and it's so cringy. He must first tear down all of my arguments and then erect in their place his own arguments that prove that there is no God. Well, no, if your arguments provide some reason to think that God resurrected, law is going to provide some of its own arguments, and then we'll compare the strength of the reasons on both sides and see if they're decisive. All of these arguments have very controversial premises that can be denied very easily by Stephen Law. So the question is just, are the premises that support belief in God more plausible than the premises that support disbelief in God? I think the answer is obviously not.
And then, in their place, erect a case of his own to prove that God does not exist. Unless and until he does that, I think that theism is the more plausible worldview.
Here, so I'm going to skip Law's opening statement. I thought it was good, but I don't have very many disagreements. It would just be sort of listening to Law. But I can just give a brief little summary. So in his opening statement, Law makes basically two arguments. So one of the arguments is that if God exists, one of them is the problem of evil. So he raises the problem of animal suffering, the problem of diseases kill, oodles and oodles and oodles of people. And then the second one is, and then he also raises the evil God objection that, all of the theodicies that Christians use to explain why a good God is compatible with evil could also be used to explain why the universe was made by an evil God, when an evil God is compatible with good. But obviously an evil God is not compatible with good. It would be absurd to think that the world was designed by a maximally evil God, and so it's similarly absurd to think that the universe was designed by a maximally good God. Just one other point that I think is worth making on Craig's opening statement. So, I think that even if we accept Craig's arguments, the best explanation of these would just be that the first entity is some sort of malicious, or not malicious, but some sort of trickster God who likes to play tricks. This would explain inconsistent historical evidence for lots of different weird historical claims. It would explain evil, it explains hiddenness, it explains inconsistent revelations, a trickster god, sort of like Loki, who's just popping around and providing inconsistent revelations to everyone. So it just explains all that data very well. And I think that I think that the God hypothesis is slightly more likely than the evil God hypothesis, but I think that the trickster God hypothesis is much more likely than either of the other two.
Stephen has offered one argument for atheism, basically the problem of evil in an evidential version. Is this a good argument for God's non-existence? Well, I think not. Now, certainly, the terrible evil and suffering in the world is the greatest emotional obstacle to belief in God. But as philosophers, we're called upon to say not how we feel about a subject, but what we think about it. And when I think hard about the problem of evil, it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult for the atheist to prove, on the basis of the evil in the world, that God does not exist. We all know cases in which we permit suffering because we have morally sufficient reasons for allowing it. What Dr. Law would have to prove is that it's impossible or highly improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. But how can the atheist possibly prove that? Maybe only in a world suffused with natural and moral evil would the maximum number of people come to freely know God and find eternal life. You see?
Well, okay, but then why is God so bad at getting people to believe in him? Why are most people on the face of the earth not Christians? There's an easy way for God to get everyone to believe in him. Just provide people with such compelling religious experience that they just, they're led logically and inescapably to him existing. It's not clear how brutal horrific suffering of the dinosaurs for billions of years before any humans were on the scene is necessary for people meeting God. Whatever God's goals are, there are much better ways of doing them. So that's just a general problem with omnipotence in the context of our universe that does not seem to be optimized for anything. But even this doesn't get out of the problem of evil. To hold that the world the world is better because malaria exists, because flesh-eating parasites that eat the eyes of infants exist. To hold that all of those things make the world overall better, it seems so inductively improbable, given the sheer totality of evil that exists. And it's hard to give an account of how any of those could be useful. Obviously, malaria is neither necessary nor sufficient for the greatest good. So why would God need to make malaria for the greater good? So the first point is just the inductive point. Second point is that if we think that God has a morally sufficient reason for malaria, then it would be bad to get rid of malaria, probably, because the world is better for malaria having existed. So Craig has to hold that every single bad thing in the world that we think of as bad has two implausible properties. One, that it's actually ultimately good, that the world is better for it having existed. But two, that despite it being actually ultimately good, though you should try to get rid of it. If you could go back in time and get rid of malaria, that would be good to do, because the spillover effects from getting rid of it, free will would be good, blah, blah, blah. And so he has to hold that that's true for every single thing in the world. But the problem is actually bigger than that, because he also has to hold that not only is the world better for them having existed, not only that despite them being overall good, should you not try to get rid of them, but it's also the case that God, that whatever purpose they fulfill could not be achieved any other way by an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. So for all of the bad things, it is good to get rid of them for any individual agent. But God, who's an omnipotent agent, it would be bad for him to get rid of them, even if he used his omnipotent power to try to figure out the best way of achieving their purpose in some other way. And that's just flatly absurd, that's true for all the evils. That's the third point. The fourth point is that if we really took this seriously, we would be at nearly complete moral impotence, because if we know any moral claims, one of the moral claims that we know is that when an infant gets trapped under a building in an earthquake, that's a bad thing. So if it turns out that actually that's a good thing, then that should undermine our confidence in every single moral claim that we want to make. So that would lead us to near complete moral nihilism. 5, this obviously can't explain hell, given that in hell we're infinitely separated from God. So there can't be a morally sufficient reason for that. And 6, there just seem to be so many evils that just seem so implausibly explained by God having a morally sufficient reason for them. When the fawn, suffers for days on end with its neck with its leg having been bitten off by the lion while it slowly bleeds out, could God not shorten its suffering by a minute? Does the last minute of its misery really have some morally sufficient reason for its existence? And that just seems absurd. And now, in terms of animal suffering, so one theodicy that you might want to tell is that God, those who suffer, God repays them in the afterlife. But Craig thinks that if you don't believe in Jesus, then you will not go to heaven. And so as a result, God's reward for the victims of the Holocaust is not an infinite pleasant afterlife, but it's burning forever, either that or annihilation. So God will inflict more suffering on every individual Holocaust victim than the sum total of all the Nazis did. Each Holocaust victim will endure more suffering at the hands of God than they will have than Holocaust victims did collectively at the hands of the Nazis. That's not the action of a perfectly good and all-loving God. That's the action of a horrendous despot. Now, this only applies to Craig's view. So if you hold that everyone will be saved, etc., it doesn't apply to your view. But what about animal suffering? Well, the animals wouldn't be. So if the animals are repaid in the afterlife, well, animals don't have free will. Many of them don't, like fish certainly don't. They just sort of act based on instinct. And animals, the soul-building theodicy just does not make much sense in terms of animals getting rewarded in the afterlife, right? I mean, if you have a fish who's suffering horrifically, and so you say that the purpose of that is to rebuild their soul in the afterlife. Well, in the afterlife, will they remain sort of like a fish, or will they become like a souped up fish? Will they become like super wise and knowledgeable and such? If they just remain like a fish, well, then it seems like they can't really gain the rewards of heaven. They can't really experience, deep enlightenment or any of the other things in heaven. They'll just experience sort of senseless, trivial pleasure, which I think Craig would say that's not the purpose of heaven. And yet if they achieve, deep, everlasting enlightenment and become like, incredibly wise in heaven, well, then how the hell did it build their soul to be a fish on earth, right? If, living for 3 hours as a fish before getting eaten by a big fish does not train you to be a fish scholar in the afterlife.
See, on the Christian view, the purpose of life is not happiness in this world, but rather coming to know God personally and so find eternal life. And many evils may be utterly pointless with respect to producing happiness in this life, but they may not be pointless with respect to producing the knowledge of God. Dr. Law would have to show that there is another world which is feasible for God, in which there is a greater knowledge of God and his salvation, but with less suffering. And that's...
Yeah, God could just provide everyone with universal revelations if God, if God wanted to. There are lots of people who God does not provide revelation to. I've never had a religious experience with God, so just the same is true of most atheists. Why doesn't God provide more revelations to atheists? It's also, yeah, I mean, what I said before, it's not clear how, every single evil in the world, especially ones that kill infants, how are those conducive to them knowing God? If you die at the age of 5, how do you know God? Also, if God wants to bring as many people as possible to him, why is belief in God so mal-distributed across the world? Like, why does God reach more people in North America than in Asia, for example? The best possible baseball player could bat more than 300. The best possible God could get more than like a third of people to believe in him and worship him, if that was his goal.
Pure speculation. Now, I think Dr. Law's own example of evil God actually proves my point. Now, first of all, it's inaccurate to call this being an evil God, because God, by definition, is a being which is necessarily good.
Okay, call it an evil, not God, an evil deity that's omniscient and omnipotent.
Peter Millikan, professor of philosophy at Oxford University, says what makes the supreme being worthy of worship is not simply his power, but rather his moral excellence. For the supreme being to be an appropriate object of religious...
Yeah, this is obviously incredibly pedantic.
Attitudes, therefore, he must, above all, be morally good. So you cannot have, literally speaking, an evil God, because he would not be worthy of worship. What you could have would be an evil creator of the universe, who is not God. And I would argue that just as you cannot prove that the creator is evil because of the bad things in life, so you cannot prove that he is good because of the good things in life. The two cases are on a par. Just as good things don't disprove the existence of anti-God, so bad things don't disprove the existence of God. I think Dr. Law's mistake is that he thinks that the theist arrives at the doctrine of God's goodness by an inductive survey of the world's events, and that's simply incorrect. As Michael Bergman and Jeff Brower point out in their response to Dr. Law, traditional theists have never argued for God's perfect goodness by simply inferring it from the existence of some good in the world. Rather, what the theist can do is to present a more...
Well, no. So the claim is that... So the claim is that we would rule out... So it's not that we infer God's goodness by the amount of goodness in the world. It's that we rule out an evil God by there being a large amount of goodness. There being tons of goodness in the world being, it being unclear whether the world has more goodness or badness, more happiness or suffering, rules out both a perfectly good and perfectly evil God. It's not a necessary condition to rule out God, but it's certainly a sufficient condition for ruling out God.
Moral argument, such as I have done, for God as the foundation of objective moral values. And that leads directly to the final point I want to make on this. Moral evil actually proves the existence of God. For we may argue in the following way. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore objective moral values exist. Some things are evil. Therefore, God exists. In the end, Dr. Law admits, and I quote, it's possible that a cogent moral argument along the above lines might yet be constructed. I suspect that this is the most promising line of attack for theists to take. And this is precisely the line that I've taken in my published work. To summarize then, number 1, Dr. Law cannot prove...
Craig doesn't have published work about the moral arguments, I don't think. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that Craig has just not published about the moral argument, because it's not the moral, the Kalam is has serious scholarly publication, but Craig's bastardized version of moral argument that just, if there's no God, nothing's good, is just not something that is taken very seriously in philosophy. Now, moral arguments, I don't think that they do it, because so you can say that the evil God, evil is established through its character, and then good is just the privation of evil.
That God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil.
Here, Vorchasm, shoot me a DM, and we can argue about this in a little bit.
That occur. 2, his anti-God objection fails because I agree that the good things in the world fail to disprove anti-God. And 3, evil in the world actually proves God's existence, because apart from God, there is no foundation for objective moral values. Now, let me say one more thing about animal predation and suffering, since this feature...
Okay, so, the moral argument, which is kind of a shit argument that is not taken very seriously, Craig agrees that that if the moral argument fails, then we have just no reason to think that God is good. And so But I think that you can run a sort of parallel evil God argument. So you can say, like, much like Craig says that good, that the God, if there's no God, you couldn't have evil, because evil is just a privation of good. Evil makes no sense without good. You could say you couldn't have good without evil. The evil God is the objective standard for evil, and then do that.
Largely in his argument. Number one, animals are part of a broader ecosystem in which the human drama is played out, and such an ecosystem must be balanced if it's to be viable. It is no accident that every ecosystem involves predators of some sort. For example, I also recently saw a program on television about how the Canadian authorities are reintroducing wolves into the wild in Canada. Why? Because in the absence of these predators, the caribou herds were overpopulating because there was none.
Right, so this is true. This is a true contingent fact about biology, but there's no like necessary logical law that means that God had to design the world that way.
No one to pick off the diseased and the aged, and as a result, they were overgrazing and therefore dying of starvation. The predators actually enhanced the survivability.
Make more food, or make it so that beings don't need to eat food.
And the health of the caribou herds on which they preyed. So the predators are an essential part of an ecosystem. In a world without predators, the insects would soon take over, since there would be nothing to eat them, and all the animals would soon die.
Well, then don't make our strategists. This is not difficult.
Because all the vegetation would be consumed by insects. And once the insects have consumed all the vegetation, they would die off as well. So any viable ecosystem needs to have predation.
Yeah, make it so that animals don't need food. Like this needing food design makes it so that there's mass starvation
in order to succeed. Now, let me say one other thing, however, that is a result of recent scientific discoveries that shed...
Vorchasm, I'm not sure if you're still in the chat, but if you are, shoot me a DM. My Discord is Omni, hashtag 3252. Shoot me a DM, and let's argue about this in a bit when I'm done with this video.
Remarkable light on the problem of animal suffering. In his book, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, published by Oxford University Press, Michael Murray explains that there is really a threefold hierarchy of pain awareness. On the most fundamental level, there's simply the reaction to stimuli, such as an amoeba exhibits when you poke it with a needle. It doesn't really feel pain. There's a second level of pain awareness, which sentient animals have, which is an experience of pain. And animals like horses, dogs, and cats would experience this second level pain awareness. But they do not experience a third level pain awareness, which is the awareness of second order pain. That is the awareness that one is itself.
Yeah, so humans feel more pain than animals per human. But the total amount of pain experienced by... Yeah, okay, I got your DM. I'll have you on in a minute. The total amount of suffering experienced by animals is greater than the total amount of suffering experienced by humans.
Himself in pain. For that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness. And this is centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section of the brain that is missing in all animals except for the higher primates and human beings. And therefore, even though animals are in pain, they aren't aware of it. They don't have this third order pain awareness. They are not aware of pain, and therefore they do not suffer as human beings.
Well, so they're not aware of being aware of pain, but they are aware of the pain. This also applies equally to like infants and mentally disabled people. But Craig would presumably still hold that it's bad when they suffer.
Beings do. Now, this is a tremendous comfort to those of us who are animal lovers like myself, or to pet owners. Even though your dog or your cat may be in pain, it really isn't aware of being in pain, and therefore it doesn't.
Craig is not Craig's not a vegetarian, so he pays for animals to be sort of brutally tortured. There was a great moment in the debate with Shelley Kagan when Kagan, so Craig was like, "Oh, I think that the arguments for animal suffering, that theism is better able to account for animal suffering because it says that we should, care about animals the way that a shepherd attends after sheep." And Kagan pointed out that Craig pays for animals to be, chopped up, killed, so he can eat and wear them. And so it's not really an advantage to his view if his view is okay with, really torturing animals for minimal pleasures.
Suffer as you would when you are in pain. The problem is that we are so often guilty of anthropopathism. That is to say, we treat animals as though they were human beings. We think of the deer in the forest like Bambi, having human consciousness and self-awareness. And this is simply fallacious. There's an actual name for this. It's called the hyperactive agency detection device, the tendency to regard animals as though they were agents. But once we understand the biology of animals, what we see is that God, in his mercy, has spared the animal world the experience of suffering, such as human beings exhibit. So I think that this goes a long way towards solving problems that Dr. Law indicates. In any case, those 3 points remain. He cannot show that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for the suffering in the world. His anti-God objection fails because goodness in the world doesn't disprove anti-God. And in any case, evil in the world actually proves the existence of God himself.
Thank you very much. If I could just encourage anyone not to call out during the speeches, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And just a reminder that if you have a question, now is the time to write it down, as we'll be collecting those in after this round, as we invite Stephen Law for his first rebuttal.
Okay.
Good. Well, Professor Craig made some interesting points out. I'll respond to them as many as I can in the time available to me. First of all, Professor Craig seemed to be suggesting that I think Christians think God is good because they draw that conclusion on the basis of what they see of the world around them. Well, obviously, I don't believe that. He's attacking a straw man at that point. I assume that Christians...
Okay, wait, I'll be back in one. Okay, I'm back.
Some other reasons for thinking that God is good, because it's pretty obvious from what we see of the world around us that it really does not support that belief. That's certainly not why I think that Christians believe that God is good, not at all. So that was just an attack on a straw man. It's not my position, very obviously. Secondly, Professor Craig suggested in his opening speech, that the existence of evil proves God. It's a popular move. I mean, not taken terribly seriously in philosophical circles, but more widely, you do find this on the internet. You find people saying this. They think, oh, this is a good persuasive argument. They say that, in a way, the existence of God, or the existence of evil...
True! It is not taken seriously in philosophical circles. It's just an apologetic trick.
Will prove that there's a God, because it's only if there's a God that there can be such things as good and evil. Well, first of all, that argument begs the question that you need God to have good and evil, and that Professor Craig has seemingly failed to do this evening, but I'll explain why that is so in a short period of time. The more important point is this: you can run the evidential problem of evil without mentioning evil at all. You don't need the concept of evil. I, as an atheist, don't need to buy into the concept of good or evil. I could be a moral nihilist. All you need is the observation that there's just an enormous amount of suffering, far more than can be plausibly explained in terms of God's mysterious ways.
Also true. It's an internal critique, not an external critique.
High purpose. That's all I need to point to. Christians can buy into the concept of good and evil. I don't need to in order to run the objection. And in fact, this is widely recognised to be true. You can set up the problem of evil without even using the concept of evil. You don't have to buy into the concept of evil to run it. So that's just a red herring. Okay. It's not true that evil proves God. His other main argument seemed to be that, well, basically to concede that you can't be pretty confident that there's no evil God on the basis of the amount of good that we see around us. Well, yeah, clearly. We all know that's not true. I mean, we can see that there is an immense amount of good stuff in the world, and it's just implausible that it can be squared in some way with the existence of an all-powerful and supremely malignant deity. Yes, there are all these ingenious explanations we can concoct and gerrymander, but the fact is, we can all see, we all know, and we will confidently dismiss, rightly so, the evil God hypothesis purely on the basis of what we can see of the universe around us. And if we can do that, then why can't we do it for the good?
Yeah, I mean, the moral argument is extremely precarious and hangs on an extremely tentative philosophical basis. And if Craig's only basis for rejecting the evil God hypothesis is based on the moral argument, then that's just not good support at all. Like, it seems like we don't need to know the moral argument to know that the world was not created by a maximally evil deity.
God hypothesis. Professor Craig has not answered that question. That is the challenge I'm setting. In order to avoid the challenge, he's basically having to get incredibly skeptical. He's really having to play the mystery card at this point and say, oh, we just can't know whether there's an evil God on the basis of looking at the world around us. Really? Cool, the other one would be, my response to that. And if we can show, beyond reasonable doubt, I'm not using the word proof, I don't like it, beyond reasonable doubt, there is no evil God on the basis of empirical observation of the world around us, then why on earth can't we show that there's no good God on the basis of empirical observation of the world around us, the sheer quantity of bad stuff that there is? That's basically the challenge I'm putting forward, and it seems to me that Professor Craig is just having to play a highly implausible sceptical card in order to try and get himself out of trouble at this point. And that's the best he can do at this point, because we can't know. We couldn't possibly know that, whether or not there's an evil God on the basis of observation of the world around us. I just don't buy it. Professor Craig has also run, I forgot which one he did it now, he has run an afterlife kind of explanation. He said that the evils we experience in this world become easier to understand for a theist once we remember that we can look forward to an eternity of bliss in heaven. There is a higher reason, there's a higher purpose. It's not all about life here on this planet. Such, as I've already pointed out in my opening speech, such afterlife type explanations can also be run by someone who believes in an evil God. They can insist that the goods we experience in this life will be more than adequately outweighed by the horrors of spending eternity in the company of the supremely malignant deity in the next. Clearly, that's not good enough as an explanation, as a defense of reasonableness. The belief that believing in evil God is reasonable. And if it won't do in defense of believing in evil God, then why on earth should we find it remotely plausible as a defense of belief in a good God? So I can't see that Professor Craig has really got a decent response here at all. In fact, many of the moves that he usually makes have just not cropped up, interestingly, probably because he can see that they're not going to work once we start thinking about the evil God hypothesis. It's a very simple challenge. We can see, on the basis of observation of the world around us, the sheer quantity of good stuff there is, that there's more than enough to justify the conclusion that there is no supremely malignant, all-powerful deity in charge of the universe. And if that is true, then it just won't wash to say, oh, but we can't know that there isn't a good God, because perhaps there is some deeper reason for all of this horror that we see around us. It's clear that there is sufficient evidence, I think. And it seems to me, really, what I find most baffling, I think, is the extent to which people just can't see that. And the extraordinarily convoluted maneuvers, intellectual maneuvers that they have to go through in order to try and convince themselves that what they believe is not, given the available evidence, downright ridiculous. So I think I've dealt with most of Professor Craig's points. He also made some appeals to some explanations of all animal suffering, which basically were variants of the appeal to laws of nature, which I've already pointed out. You can flip those kinds of theology. I'm not even going to attempt to do so now, but we could do that. So I think I've covered most of the points I'm going to make there. Let me just repeat. I think that Professor Craig's point is we're just not in a position to judge with any confidence that it's improbable that God lacks morally good reasons for creating or allowing all this suffering. He argued that our failure to discern God's reasons is not a good reason to suppose that God doesn't have them. Perhaps in some way we cannot fathom they contribute to our eternal salvation. But as I pointed out, much the same reply can be made by someone who believes in an evil God. Evil God is also omnipotent and omniscient, so of course his reasons are also likely to be largely beyond our ken. Those God's goods that seem gratuitous with regard to the aims of an evil God may not be gratuitous at all, I might argue. Show a little of humility, don't presume to know the mind of evil God. If this sort of sceptical smokescreen doesn't succeed in salvaging belief in an evil God, then I fail to see why it salvages belief in Craig's good God either.
Yeah, so that was a good defense of the evil God part, but he did not respond to like any of Craig's main arguments, which was
Let's invite William Lane Craig back to the podium as he responds again to Stephen Law.
And I gave my responses earlier to why I think that I think the evil God objection is one good objection, but I think that there are other objections to Craig's brand of skeptical theism.
So far as I could hear, Dr. Law has yet to respond to any of my three arguments under my first contention that there are good reasons to believe that God exists.
Well, the crowd's like cheering. They're like, yes, he didn't respond. Ha! Get him, Craig.
First, he has not responded to my argument based on the origin of the universe. At best, he would have to say, well, we don't.
I do high school debate, and in high school debate, if you don't respond to an argument, it's like seen as true absent refutation. And it's like Craig has like taken that to apply to like very complex scholarly debates. He'll throw out these very complicated philosophical arguments and just sort of run through them, and then I don't know. I think that Craig is just really skilled at like responding to everything, good at taking notes, writing down his responses, understands the way debate works, which makes him tough to debate. But when he just has like one-on-one conversations with people like Oppie, even someone like Scott Clifton, like it doesn't go as well for Craig, because Craig is not as good at just like beating those at like sort of beating back those arguments as he is at just sort of rattling off lots of arguments fairly quickly, talks pretty fast, but like it doesn't sound like he's talking that fast. He like speaks confidently. He's a really good debater, but less good at like just sort of one-on-one argumentation.
Don't know if this being is good who has created the world. And I grant that. You can't know that from this argument. But it is a strange form of atheism, one not worth the name, that admits that there is a beginningless, uncaused, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, enormously powerful personal creator of the universe. That, I don't think, deserves to be called atheism. So he's got to interact with this argument because the problem of evil doesn't refute it, because it doesn't say anything about the moral properties of this being. Secondly, what about the argument based upon the existence of objective moral values and duties? Here, frankly, I was stunned and disappointed to hear him retreat from his affirmation of objective moral values in his published work to now regarding this as being non-objective. And then you've got to deal with the problem that the objectivity of moral values is more obvious than any argument for moral skepticism. The atheist philosopher Peter Cave puts it this way: whatever skeptical arguments may be brought against our belief that killing the innocent is morally wrong, we are more certain that the killing is morally wrong than that the argument is sound. Torturing an innocent child for the sheer fun of it is morally wrong. Full stop. And
I don't think Law really walked back anything. I just think the Law just didn't really get to this argument.
That's why John Cottingham reports that there's an increasing consensus among philosophers today that some sort of objectivism is correct. The problem is that on atheism there is no explanation for the reality of objective moral values and duties, and that's what theism will give you. Thirdly, the argument concerning the resurrection of Jesus has not even been addressed in tonight's debate. So are there
well, maybe an evil God would resurrect him. Or, here's my hypothesis. Maybe there's a sort of Loki-esque trickster God that resurrects Jesus, resurrected Joseph Smith, did like miracles that are talked about in the Quran, and it's just like popping around playing tricks and is providing all this inconsistent revelation.
Probably good arguments for atheism. Well, I made 4 points by way of response to his argument. First, he hasn't been able to show that it's improbable or impossible that God has morally sufficient reasons for the suffering in the world. And he really admits this. His only gambit is to say, well, yeah, that's true, I can't show that, but neither can you show that the evil creator wouldn't have...
Well, no, he said it's an evidential problem. You can't show with absolute certainty that there's no reason, but like the evil God hypothesis can explain that, and the sheer totality of evil makes it incredibly unlikely.
Sufficient reasons for allowing good things in the world. Well, that's the second point. And I agree that you cannot disprove anti-God by just looking inductively at the good things in the world. The world is morally ambiguous, and that's not how theists come to believe in the goodness of God. Stephen Weitztra, who is an expert in the problem of evil, puts it this way. He says, any being, good or evil, big enough to make the heavens and the earth, gives a high conditional probability that we'd regularly be unable to discern that being's ultimate purposes for many events around us. So our actual inability to do so isn't strong evidence that those purposes...
Right, so at this point, Craig is just committed to if his immortal argument doesn't succeed, which I think it obviously doesn't for the multitude of reasons that I've laid out earlier, then he should just be agnostic between God being good and evil.
for that being isn't there. Just as the inscrutable evil in the world doesn't give much evidence that there's no totally good creator, so the inscrutable good in the world doesn't give much evidence that there's no totally evil creator. You don't decide that question inductively. And this is Dr. Law's only defense of the problem of evil, because he admits he can't give any argument to show that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. What about my third point, that evil actually proves the existence of God? Here he says, quite rightly, you don't need moral evil to run the argument from suffering. You can just talk about pain and suffering. Quite right. But then that means you have to retreat from the affirmation of objective moral values in the world. If you do affirm there are objective moral values in the world, then you're immediately confronted with the problem of the objectivity of evil.
Well, no, so it's an internal critique. If anything is bad, then infants having their eyes eaten by parasites is one of those bad things.
And its explanation. In his book, Humanism, Dr. Law says, and I quote, none of this is to deny that there is a puzzle about the objectivity of morality, about how it is possible for things to be morally right or wrong, independently of how we or even God might judge them to be. And he has no solution to this problem to offer. He is simply left without an answer to the problem of the objectivity of moral values and duties. So while it's true you can run a problem of suffering without referring to moral evil, to do so you're going to have to deny the reality and objectivity of moral values and duties, because once you admit them, then you've got the problem of the moral argument. Fourthly, I suggested that animal suffering in the world is not as serious a problem as he thinks, because animal predation is part of a viable ecosystem in which this drama is played out. And in fact, animals don't have this third-order pain awareness of knowing that they are in pain, and therefore they do not suffer as human beings do. And therefore, this problem of evil, I think, though emotionally powerful, I grant it, is emotionally powerful. Philosophically, it is very difficult to run any kind of a successful argument against God based on the evil and suffering in the world. Let me make one last point on this question. The fact is that any event that occurs in history, no matter how trivial, sends a sort of ripple effect through history, so that God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting it might not emerge until centuries from now in another country. This was already understood in classical physics. James Clerk Maxwell wrote,
But God's omnipotent.
Rock.
He doesn't need to rely on malaria doing things in ways that bring about evil. He can just wave his wand and bring about perfect goodness.
by the frost and
Or
bound
bring about whatever his purposes are.
on a singular point of the mountainside, the little spark that kindles the great forest, the little word that sets the world a fighting, the little scruple which prevents a man from doing his will, the little spore which blots all the potatoes, the little dimule which makes us philosophers or idiots. Every existence above a certain rank has its singular points. The higher rank, the more of them. At these points, influences whose physical magnitude is too small to be taken account of by a finite being may produce results of the greatest importance. The fact is that when we see an incident of evil or suffering enter our lives, we are simply not in a position to say with any kind of confidence that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting that to occur. We're simply not in a position to make those kind of judgments competently. And therefore, it's simply impossible for the atheist to show that it's improbable or impossible that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, particularly when we keep in mind the Christian concept of God and the Christian purpose of suffering. It is not to produce happiness in this life. I grant it. It is rather to provide a context in which people may freely respond to God and his offer of eternal life and forgiveness and come to know him. And it may be that only in a world that is suffused with suffering of a natural and moral sort that the maximum number of people would freely come to know God and his eternal life. Dr. Law would have to show that there's another feasible world available to God that has greater knowledge of God and his salvation than this world, but with less suffering. There's no way the atheist can do that.
And we go on to the second rebuttal, sorry, by Stephen Law. I'm giving you an extra 30 seconds, Stephen, because there was a brief malfunction with the timer that amounts to about 30 seconds extra. So if you'd like to come, we'll hear your third rebuttal.
Okay. At this point, I want to actually look at the arguments that were given for the existence of God. There were actually only two that are relevant here in terms of showing being arguments for a good God as opposed to, say, a more neutral God or an evil God. Craig's moral argument is, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. The vast majority of philosophers reject this argument. Take, for example, the Christian philosopher Professor Richard Swinburne, Oxford University. Swinburne says, I cannot see any force in an argument to the existence of God from the existence of morality. So Professor Craig is putting up against a mountain of evidence against what he believes, as provided by the problem of evil, an argument that even one of the world's leading Christian philosophers finds utterly unconvincing. If Professor Craig wants nevertheless to raise a moral argument, the onus is clearly on him to show that its premises are true. In fact, both premises are highly questionable. The first premise is, again, rejected by the vast majority of moral philosophers. One argument that Professor Craig offers, supposing that it is nevertheless true, it appears to be to point out that an evolutionary explanation of why we believe rape is objectively morally wrong wouldn't make rape objectively morally wrong. Well, so what? I mean, we all knew that already. That doesn't show that the belief isn't or cannot be true given atheism. Remember, the onus is on Professor Craig to show that no atheist-friendly account of the objective truth of moral claims can be given. The fact that evolution provides no such account very obviously does not entail no such account can be given. The onus is on Professor Craig to show that all such atheist-friendly accounts are wrong, even the ones we haven't thought of yet. And don't forget, as theists so regularly do, that they needn't even be naturalistic accounts. So far, Craig has shown one atheist-friendly account is wrong. As I say, we knew that already. What if the second premise of Craig's moral argument?
Yeah, I mean, this is true. There are like hundreds of ways that atheists have tried to grant objective morality. Like Craig can't just rule out a priori any of them work.
Objective moral values exist. This is undoubtedly a belief that just seems obviously true to us. Indeed, I'll put it forward quite happily, but I'm willing to take it back later if I need to. Okay? The mere fact that it seems true doesn't guarantee that it's true. It seems like there are objective moral values. That isn't a belief we should abandon easily, but it's by no means irrefutable. Right? After all, we have a powerful impression that the Earth doesn't move. It doesn't. I mean, it really doesn't seem to move. But if we're given powerful evidence that it does move, and it's also explained why it nevertheless seems like it doesn't move, then the rational thing for us to believe is that our initially highly convincing impression was wrong. The moral is, even if Professor Craig could show that this first premise is true, he can't deal with the problem of evil by just digging in his heels and saying, but look, it really seems to us as if there are objective moral values, so there must be a God. When placed next to the problem of evil, Craig's argument does little to undermine the problem. Rather, it just combines with it to deliver the conclusion that there are no objective moral values. That conclusion would be further reinforced by an evolutionary explanation of why it would still seem to us that there are objective moral values, even if there aren't. Now, I don't doubt Professor Craig doesn't want to believe that there are no objective moral values. Hey, I don't want to believe it, but this isn't an exercise in wishful thinking. So even if its first premise were true, and Craig could show that, and he hasn't, his moral argument still hardly offers much of a riposte to the evidential problem of evil. Let's now turn to the resurrection argument. It turns on claims made in the New Testament that there was an empty tomb, that there were independent eyewitness reports of Jesus alive after the crucifixion, and so on. The claim is that the best explanation of these alleged facts is that Jesus was resurrected by God. You should always be suspicious of arguments to the best explanation in such contexts. Let me tell you a story from 1967. It's a UFO story. There were reports of a strange object appearing nightly over a nuclear power site in Wake County. The police investigated. A police officer confirmed it was about half the size of the moon, and it just hung there over the plant. The next night, the same thing happened. The deputy sheriff described a large lighted object. The county magistrate saw, and I quote, a rectangular object, looked like it was on fire. We figured it about the size of a football field. It was huge and very bright. There was, in addition, hard data, a curious radar blip reported by local air traffic control. Now, what's the best explanation of these reports? We have multiple attestation. We have trained eyewitnesses, police officers putting their reputations on the line by reporting UFO. We have hard independent confirmation, that blip on the radar scope. Surely then it's highly unlikely these witnesses would say, or hallucinating or lying or just saw a planet. Clearly, by far the best explanation, you might think, is that they really did see a large lighted object hovering close to the plant. But here's the thing. We know pretty much for sure that what was seen by those police officers was the planet Venus. Journalists arrived on scene, were shown the object, and chased it in a car. They found they couldn't approach it. Finally, they looked at it through a long lens and saw it was planet Venus. That radar blip was just a coincidence. What does this show? Every year, there are countless amazing reports of religious miracles, alien abductions, ghosts, and so on. In most cases, it's not easy to come up with plausible, mundane explanations for them. So
this is actually, I think, a really good point. That, you know, whenever we see a magic trick, like, it's so hard to imagine how the heck, like, magic could have been done, or like how they could have done it without actual magic. But the best explanation is that we don't know how it happened, but there's some way of doing it. Like, we have a very strong inductive case for this. And so even if we don't know exactly how it played out, there's just a very, very strong inductive case for weird occurrences not indicating violations of natural laws.
it is easy to come up with plausible, mundane explanations for them. But not all, right? Some remain deeply baffling. So should we believe in such things then? No. For as my UFO story illustrates, we all know that some hard-to-explain reports of miracles, flying saucers, and so on are likely to crop up anyway, whether or not there's truth to these claims. That 1967 case could easily have been such a baffling case. So let's suppose that the biblical documents written a decade or more after the events they report, written exclusively by the devotees of a new religious movement, not even by first-hand witnesses, detailing events for which there's pretty much no independent confirmation, constitutes really, really good evidence that there was an empty tomb and that the disciples did report seeing risen Christ. Is that, in turn, good evidence that Jesus was resurrected? Evidence supports a hypothesis to the extent the evidence is expected, given the hypothesis is true and unexpected. Otherwise, the absolutely crucial point to note is this: we have good reason to expect some baffling, very hard to explain in mundane terms reports to crop up occasionally anyway, whether or not there are any miracles or gods or flying saucers. So the fact that an otherwise baffling, hard to explain case has shown up provides us with little, if any, evidence that a miracle has occurred. So
That was good. I mean, I feel like law doesn't understand sort of the way that, like you know, generally in the structured debate, law should have in that speech responded to Craig's opening statement, then in his last speech responded to Craig's responses to everything. But
Well, now both.
I think law's doing well, much better than I think like Hitchens does. I think law, you know, it's not doing quite as well as someone like Kagan or Carroll, but he's still doing very well.
William Lane Craig and Stephen Law will have 5 minutes each to sum up their arguments tonight, starting with William Lane Craig.
Wait, okay. I'm going to guess that he starts this with, as I have argued tonight, well, there are no good reasons to believe in atheism. There are many good reasons to believe in God.
Thank you. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed the debate tonight as much as I have. I've enjoyed the stimulating interaction with Stephen. I argue tonight that there are good reasons to think that God exists. My first argument, based on the origin of the universe, has gone unrefuted. Therefore, we can all agree tonight that there is an immaterial, uncaused, beginningless, spaceless, timeless, enormously powerful personal creator of the universe who may...
Oh, yes. Well, forgot to answer that.
Or may not be good. That would be a very strange form of atheism. Secondly, I've argued that objective moral values and duties points to the existence of God. First, because if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. And here, Dr. Law's only refutation was to appeal to authority. He said, well, Richard Swinburne doesn't agree with this argument. Well, granted, Richard Swinburne doesn't agree with the argument. But those who do agree with this premise include atheists like Nietzsche, Russell, Sartre, Mackey, and manifold others. So if you want to appeal to authority, I can give a long list of atheists who agree that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. One of the
Yeah, I mean, there are some, but most philosophers are atheists and
These would be Joel Marx, a philosopher who 2 months ago wrote a remarkable article called Confessions of an Ex-Moralist. He said, could I believe that the wrongness of a lie is any more intrinsic to an utterance than beauty was to a sunset, or wonderfulness to the universe? Doesn't it make far more sense to suppose that all these phenomena arise within my breast, that they are the responses of a particular sensibility to otherwise valueless
Craig has like so many quotes of random people saying things. It's pretty fun.
and entities? Someone else might respond completely differently. For me, such that for him the lie was permissible, the sunset banal, and the universe nothing but atoms and the void. And so Marx came to realize that as an atheist, he had to give up his belief in the objectivity of moral values and duties. He said, I used to think animal agriculture was wrong. Now I will call a spade and declare simply that I very much dislike it and want it to stop. I'm simply no longer in in the business of trying to derive an ought from an is. It seems to me Marx is entirely justified there. In the absence of God, there just is no explanation that the naturalist can propose that would explain the existence of objective values and duties. And this is critical. As Shelley Kagan, a Yale ethicist, has said, this need for explanation in moral theory cannot be overemphasized. One of the things we want our moral theory to help us understand is how there can even be a moral realm and what sort of objective status it has. And Dr. Law simply hasn't offered anything, whereas the theist can offer a transcendent ground in God, his nature, and his commands. So I think that theism offers us
but then there's Sisyphus' dilemma and all the myriad of problems.
a better foundation for the objective moral values that we all hold dear. What about the resurrection of Jesus? Dr. Law rightly points out that there are many reports of paranormal phenomena. These ought to make us very cautious in assessing miracle claims. But I would say two things. First of all, any claim must be weighed by objective criteria: explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, degree of ad hocness. And I don't know of any natural explanation that passes those criteria, as well as the explanation that God raised Jesus from the dead. Secondly, the resurrection of Jesus.
But the same thing could be said with like the UFO and saucer things. Like there are lots of cases where we have no idea why they happened, where you could explain them with magic, but it's not
I think is plausible because of the religio-historical context in which it occurs. It's not a bald anomaly occurring without a context. It comes as the climax to Jesus of Nazareth's own unparalleled life and ministry, a man who claimed to be the absolute revelation of God.
A life during which he condemned hand washing and getting a divorce.
And the way to eternal life is this man has been raised from the dead, and that he has been vindicated by God in those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. And therefore, I think these claims have a degree of plausibility that paranormal phenomena would not. So I think we've got good grounds for believing in Christian theism. What about atheism? Well, basically, all we've heard is the evil God objection, but as I explained, you can't disprove the evil creator hypothesis just by appealing to goods in the world. And similarly, you cannot disprove the good creator hypothesis by appealing to evils in the world. Why? Because we're not in a position to judge with any confidence when some incident of suffering occurs that God has no morally sufficient reason for allowing it to occur. And therefore, I'm convinced that on balance, the weight of the evidence tips clearly in the side of Christian theism. And for that reason,
I think sort of with Law's argument, like imagine a version of chess that was like exponentially more complicated. That was like that was with like 50 times as many pieces. It would be sort of hard at the start to figure out whether or not the person is the best possible player or the worst possible player. If they sort of, play to where they get it, where they, are in the end game and both sides have like a knight and a rook and they were playing against a mediocre player, we could be pretty confident that they were neither the best nor the worst possible chess player. And I think the same thing is true of God. When we see that the world is nowhere near as good as it could have been, we can see that, not the best possible God.
And enthusiastically a Christian theist.
And finally, I invite Dr. Stephen Law to come and present his final summing up.
If I wanted to have this have a very clickbait title, I could call it Craig Against the Law.
I started out by pointing out that as we look back across the hundreds of millions of years of sentient life on this planet, we find suffering on a stupendous scale. For example, we humans have, over many hundreds of thousands of generations, had to watch a third to a half of our children die painfully in our arms. Immense suffering and horror are built into the fabric of the world we are forced to inhabit. My contention is that this suffering does constitute powerful observational evidence against Professor Craig's God.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, to get back to the chess analogy, like if the chess player just like blundered a knight for like just no clear reason, and then did this like 10 times, imagine this game where like the average games lasted like 10,000 moves and were very, very complicated, etc. They just blundered a knight for just like obviously no reason. Every chess commentator on Earth who was competent agreed that like there was just no good reason for their move. Like computers couldn't produce a reason. It would be reasonable to infer that they're not the best possible chess players. Same thing's true of God.
Even many Christians acknowledge it constitutes a very powerful intellectual threat to their belief. I challenge Professor Craig to explain why, given this mountain of evidence, belief in his good God is supported by the evidence and arguments. In particular, why is belief in his good God better supported than belief in an evil God, which is clearly absurd, which clearly is undermined by observation of the world around us. Who believes in an evil God? Nobody. Why not? Take a look around you. Professor Craig has spectacularly failed to meet this challenge. He's tried to explain the mountain of suffering, of course. He appealed to the promise of an afterlife, but mostly he's just played the mystery card, played the skeptical card, insisting that God has his good reasons for unleashing hundreds of thousands of years of horror. It's just that we're not in a position to know what they are. All right, okay. I pointed out these explanations can be used just as effectively to deal with the evidence against the evil God hypothesis. So obviously they failed to show that belief in a good God is better supported than belief in an evil God. Those moves are neutral. So Professor Craig is now going to have to rely on his arguments for a good God. He has to balance things up at all. He has to show that his belief is more reasonable than the belief in an evil God. But only two of his arguments are actually even relevant, so I ignored the first one. These are the arguments that he did offer for his good God were remarkably weak. He offered a moral argument, but such moral arguments, as I pointed out, are rejected by the vast majority of moral philosophers. Even Richard Swinburne thinks Craig's moral argument fails. But I wasn't relying on that for authority. I just pointed out that Professor Craig provided no justification for the first premise of the argument, and he still hasn't. He still hasn't provided a decent justification for the first premise of the argument. The argument has a very dubious first premise. If there's no God, there are no objective moral values. Why should we believe that? There's been no argument. But even if he could show that it was true, I pointed out he would not have succeeded in showing that belief in his God is reasonable more reasonable than belief, significantly more reasonable than belief in an evil God. For of course, when placed next to a mountain of observational evidence that there's no such God, his moral argument merely generates the conclusion that there are no more objective moral values. The conclusion that, while counterintuitive, can't just be assumed. So in fact, Craig's moral argument kind of presupposes that he's already dealt with the evidential problem of evil. You can't use it against as a counterbalance to the evidential problem of evil. His other argument was the resurrection argument, which is frankly, almost comically flimsy. Even many Christians, including Alvin Plantinga, and again, this is not an appeal to authority, just to illustrate the point, consider it terribly weak. So let's not lose sight of the weight of argument and evidence on either side of this debate. There is a mountain of observational evidence against Craig's God. He has signally failed to explain that evidence away. He's just played the mystery card. He offered a couple of arguments for his particular God, but they turned out to be at best.
I just want to say I have a good deal of respect for Swinburne and Plantinga. I think that they're both incredibly smart, and I especially appreciate, well, for Plantinga, I think that I appreciate the intellectual honesty, agreeing that the historical evidence isn't very strong. For Swinburne, I appreciate the Bayesian methods that they employ. I think that if I became a theist, the theist who I would agree with the most would be Swinburne.
Well, weedy. Indeed, both have high-profile Christian critics. The moral argument relied on a premise for which we've seen no...
Plantinga is also just so fun to listen to. I really enjoy listening to Plantinga speak. He's quite a good speaker.
Decent argument whatsoever. So I think it is indeed spectacularly clear where the balance of probability lies. We may not know why the universe exists, but we can quite reasonably rule certain answers out, such as that an evil God created it. We all know that. We can, for much the same sort of reasons, observational reasons, quite reasonably also rule out the suggestion that Professor Craig's good God created it. That's the end. If any of you want to explore the kind of argument I've sketched out tonight, please take a look at my paper, The Evil God Challenge, which is in religion. That's another one. We were talking about Professor Craig's God. In Religious Studies 2010, there's also a condensed version of this argument in my most recent book, should you wish to purchase it. Okay, thank you very much.
Wait, I didn't hear what was shouted out. Let's see.
In my most recent book, should you wish to purchase it. Okay, thank you very much. In Religious Studies 2010, there's also a condensed version of this argument in my most recent book, should you wish to purchase it. Okay, thank you very much.
I keep missing the...
Good God created it. That's the end. If any of you want to explore the kind of argument I've sketched out tonight, please take a look at my paper, The Evil God Challenge, which is in religion. That's another one.
Wait, they're saying, what about a God that's not good or evil?
We were talking about Professor Craig's God. In Religious Studies 2010, there's also a condensed version of this argument in my most recent book, should you wish to purchase it. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, Bill and Stephen. It's been a fascinating debate, I'm sure you'll agree, and we're going to move now into our discussion time. So if I could ask the helpers to come and move the chairs and table into the centre. I've selected what I hope is a good representative sample of...
I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, and... Right. Okay, so I'm going to have Vorchasm on. Actually, no, sorry. I'm going to have Vorchasm on in about 10 minutes. I think I'm going to make a new stream just because, no need to condense them both into the same one. But yeah, that was a good debate. Thanks for watching, everyone, and tune in 10 minutes. Right, peace.